What's up, everybody? Thank you very much for listening to the Whatcast. Mike, we're going to talk about some Bigfoot stuff, but just not your normal Bigfoot stuff. We're going to get weird with Bigfoot.
Yeah, I like the weirder cases with Bigfoot sightings, and there's this book that's been out for a few years, and there's a second volume that more recently came out, but it's called Where the Footprints End. It's just a lot of weird stuff that happens with Bigfoot sightings, like stuff outside of just seeing a hairy thing in the distance walk by. You know, like this is the weird stuff, like where, well, we'll get into it, but it's just the way that the book breaks down. It's probably something that we'll cover piece by piece over time. You know, not do one on top of the other, but you expect to hear Bigfoot weirdness popping up on the show from time to time. But tonight, I wanted to talk about York County, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding area, because this seems, for some reason, to be one of those places in the world where all matter of weirdness just starts happening.
Nice.
Yeah. And the history of the area goes back pretty far with stories of the paranormal or hauntings or all sorts of weird things like that. But it seems to kind of centralize in this area in southeastern York County specifically. And it's in the Muddy Creek Bridge and Peach Bottom area, all the way to the Susquehanna River in the east and the Mason-Dixon line in the south. So like this little area, it's about 8 square miles, I believe. But it seems to have this huge concentration of all sorts of weirdness. And this even goes back to the early 1800s. I'm not sure if there was anything reported before that or if the natives had any legends about the area. But I know throughout the 1800s, the roads along this area were said to be haunted, and it got to the point where certain travelers, I guess none but the brave, would go out along these roadways at night, because there were reports of a headless ghost that would walk the area, but there were also rumors of unknown creatures that would hide in the shadows. And they were not only fearsome to behold, but they were also dangerous to travelers if encountered on the road. And the deal with the ghost was that there was this body found in this area. There's these slate quarries, and in one of the quarries there was a body found without a head, and they never found the head. So this ghost is said to walk the roads in this area. The headless miner. I don't know, but that's way she goes, I suppose. But I love stories of headless ghosts for some reason. They just like tickle some fancy inside of me. Like it brings me back to being a kid and just like watching Scooby-Doo or seeing the old Disney Headless Horseman cartoon. And I don't know, it brings me back to being a kid and being in awe of ghost stories and thinking about what if it was real. And this sort of story just makes me go back there. It takes me back, Mateo.
That's the best ones. I mean, it's got to be disturbing enough to see a ghost. I mean, even as an adult, there's a lot of us that have seen something like that. But yeah, that's a little bit more unnerving. It like solidifies the fact that it's something unnatural.
Yeah. And what's the deal with these fearsome creatures that were dangerous to travelers on the road? Like what? They were just said to be creatures that lurked in the shadows. So there's not even a real description of what they are.
Right, and you got to assume that the locals are familiar with the local wildlife.
Right. Could it be that this was evil Bigfoot? Angry Bigfoot?
Yeah, maybe like a savage Bigfoot.
Yeah, maybe. But I've got this weird. This is like the first weird story in the book. This happened in late October of 1886 in Delta, Pennsylvania. There's a man named Nehemiah Cooper, and he's walking home from a service at Mount Nebo Church with his wife and a couple of their friends. And as they're walking home, they see this something in the road. They don't know what it is. It's this weird shape. But they said it was about the size of a bucket. So, what, maybe 10 inches tall, maybe 10 inches wide at the mouth. I don't know. Somewhere in there. But they saw this thing. It was the size of a bucket, they said. And as they're walking closer, all of a sudden this thing springs up from the ground. And as it sprung up from the ground, it grew into a monster that was 12 to 15 feet tall and 6 to 7 feet wide.
Holy crap.
And, obviously that it would make you jump seeing something like that happen. But because it was so close to Halloween, they thought maybe it was some sort of Halloween prankster. So they started picking up rocks along the road and throwing them, trying to call out the prankster or whatever. And this creature was not fazed at all by the rocks, and it began to approach them. And seeing this, the group realizes their rocks aren't going to do shit, and this thing is coming at them. So they just turn and they ran, and no one else reported seeing this particular creature, but they reported it as soon as they got back. And nothing ever came from that creature again. That was that.
Was it humanoid in shape, or?
Yeah, it was bipedal humanoid. But when they saw it, it looked like something that was small on the ground, and they said it was the size of a bucket, and it just like sprang up and grew.
I've never heard anything like that before.
Yeah, it's fucking bonkers, man. Completely fucking bonkers. And 12 to 15 feet tall. Like, think about most Bigfoot sightings. They're typically in the 8 to 10 feet range for the most part. Like, once you start getting into 12 to 15 feet tall, that's really big for a Bigfoot claim. Right. And I know that there are claims out there for the 12 to 15 footers, but
right.
They're few and far between.
God damn. I mean, I recently was looking at a website that sells all casts from, I think, Jeff Meldrum's collection.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I was just browsing through all of them, and they're giant. They're fucking awesome. But can you just imagine the print of one that's 15, 16 feet tall?
Right.
That would dwarf a Bigfoot footprint.
Well, and plus, so 12 to 15 feet tall and 6 to 7 feet wide. Like, you gotta think how much this thing must weigh. And
right.
And I always use, when comparing Bigfoot sighting or Bigfoot, the weight of a Bigfoot creature, I always use the Big Show as my base of comparison. Because he's 7 foot tall, 500 pounds. And I know legitimately he's like 6'11", and he's, at the time, was like 450 or something. But still, we're rounding up, 7 feet tall, 500 pounds. And that's the Big Show. This thing is double that.
Jesus. If you guys don't know, the Big Show is a wrestler from...
Yeah. I figured he's pretty close to being a household name that most people would know the Big Show. But I forget, I don't know.
Toothpaste sandwich.
Maybe not everybody. But if we're doubling the size, the weight is going to more than double, because you got to figure in for bone density and muscle mass. So this thing is, I would say, is probably between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds.
What the fuck? They're lucky to get out of there.
Yeah. How can this thing even support itself?
Yeah.
It's a goddamn multi-dimensional creature, that's why.
Yep.
It's not physical as we know it. Oh,
yeah,
fucking scary, man.
Yeah, that's a scary thought, man, to picture that thing. I mean, 15 feet tall is pretty crazy, but to see something that's 8 feet wide, again, that's an aspect that makes it unnatural and just, I mean,
right.
What the fuck?
Right. Like there's nothing in this world that's that big on two legs.
Right. Except for the whatever's in front of me right now.
Yeah. Except for this fucker.
What I'm dealing with at this moment.
Yes. Yes. At this very moment, this thing is big as shit, and I don't know what the hell it is. But nothing else that I know is this big, and that's terrifying. So this is just like one weird story from the area, but it's, like I said, it seems to be an area that has multiple different phenomena that occur. And so there's a couple haunted houses in the area, or, well, I should say there were a couple haunted houses. There's one called Mcconkey Mansion, which was built in the late 1700s, but it was eventually torn down to make room for the Peach Bottom atomic power plant in the mid 1900s. I think the 60s maybe. But this was built in the late 1700s. But in the time that it was there was, and even after it had been abandoned, there was all sorts of weird phenomena that occurred there. And there would be these strange mists that would collect along the grounds, and there'd be weird colored, what was described as will-o'-the-wisps. So, weird ghost lights that would move around. And these lights, they would often be seen gliding down the walls of the house, and then they would fly off along the property and head towards the Susquehanna River.
Whoa.
And all along the property, there were these rhododendron bushes and wild ferns that they would grow all over the grounds, except for these two areas that were known as fairy rings, which were lined with this tall grass. And inside the ring, all the plant life that was in there was greener than any of the surrounding plants on the grounds. And it was said, the family that built the mansion, the Mcconkey family, they were Irish. So it was said that maybe they brought a curse back with them, or they were followed by a leprechaun who took up residence on the grounds and was the source of the will-o'-the-wisps and the fairy rings and the ghosts that were said to, or the spirits that were said to be there. But we've talked a lot on the show about how animals seem to react to the paranormal, and horses would refuse to get too close to the mansion, so they had to hobble the horses a distance away from the mansion because the horses would refuse to go.
You gotta walk it in.
Yeah. But like I said, this thing, so all this weird shit happened there, and then eventually this place was torn down and it became the Peach Bottom atomic power plant. But there's another place in the area that was known as the Suicide House, and it was said to be haunted by someone that committed suicide. But there was a family that moved in there, and they reported these shadowy figures that would look in their windows, and they would hear off in the distance at night, they would hear these screams and howls, which, as you'll see as we go along, is indicative of a lot of Bigfoot sightings in the area.
God, that's got to be, to me, that's just as scary as seeing a Bigfoot. Is hearing
hearing it?
Yeah, even a lot of those YouTube videos with the Bigfoot vocalizations. A lot of people don't give those too many credit, but I mean, if it's too believed, most of the time it's just people in a cabin or people out hunting at night. But just to hear something like that, that's some of the, every time I hear those, my fucking skin crawls.
Well, it's going back to just being in the woods and just hearing a noise you don't know, like my deer encounter, for instance, or like if you hear those, if you ever listen to fox calls at night, they sound like fucking banshees or ghosts. Like it doesn't sound like a natural creature. And if you don't know what it is, I could see that easily being mistaken as a fucking ghost in the woods, especially with like the echo effect. It's just goddamn terrifying, man. You're in the dark and you hear these crazy noises and you have no way to identify it. And it's like, hellish demon beast. And that's all that goes through your head. But so we've got all this weird shit that happened. But then, for some reason, in the 1970s, reported sightings of Bigfoot started to increase. Now, I don't know if this is because by the 70s, the idea of Bigfoot was now kind of like a widespread thing, and maybe that's why we were getting more sightings, because people had some sort of comparison. You know, like they have seen the Patterson-Gimlin footage at that point, and it had been talked about, and Bigfoot was becoming a household name at that point. So I don't know if it's due to an influx in the area. Although I will say, by the 1970s, most of those slate quarries had been shut down. So maybe, harvesting all of that slate that requires explosions and heavy machinery and all that shit. Maybe that kept them away, but then when they stopped, they came back to the area. That's maybe, I guess, if you're looking at them as being like flesh and blood migratory species, like an unknown animal species, that would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're looking at them as being these like weird spiritual or magical or interdimensional creatures, then maybe it was something like the explosions and the machinery was interfering with their ability to come through. Or maybe it's just the fact that people had something to identify it with. No, who knows?
Yeah, what to name a phenomenon that's known to go on in the area.
One of the first reported, I don't even really want to call it a sighting because nothing was actually seen, but the behavior is very reminiscent of what we hear regarding other like warning encounters with Bigfoot. So this guy named Bob Chance is an ecology teacher, and he was going on a nature trip with some of his students through this thickly wooded area along Muddy Creek. And Muddy Creek eventually leads into the Susquehanna River. And during the trip, their canoe got stuck in this muddy bank. So they decided they're going to just leave it there for now. They tie it up to a tree so it doesn't float downstream. And they take the rest of the trip on foot and decide to come back a few days later and retrieve the canoe and continue their path down the creek into the river with the canoe and go from there. So a few days later, they come back, and as they're going to get the canoe out of the mud, from the hill above them, they start having this rain of rocks come down on them. And they don't see anybody, they don't hear anybody, but these rocks just keep getting thrown at them from this unseen source up on the hill. And having heard about Bigfoot and kind of hearing some reports, some of the reported behavior, Bob Chance decides to investigate the other Bigfoot sightings that occur in the area. And so he was working with the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and was, I guess, documenting or investigating other weird cases. But from 1973 to 1976, there was an even larger increase, and this was when there were the most sightings in the area. And the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization had records of multiple sightings of a hairy man-like creature, typically around Muddy Creek. And they were getting reports from campers, from hikers, from students, and from hunters. And they all seemed to be describing a similar creature, 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair. And there were some footprints that were documented, and they measured the gait, and the stride of this creature was about 4 feet.
Wow.
And for some reason, most of these sightings took place near the old slate quarry sites. And like I said, they were abandoned by 1970.
That's a perfect place to hide and live.
Yeah. Yeah, and most of these sightings, like it wasn't it wasn't an aggressive encounter. It was just people seeing these creatures in the woods, peeking behind trees or catching them up the trail, crossing the trail, things like that. But in 1974, there was a family who owned property just off Muddy Creek. And they were having a house built on their property. And while the house was being built, they were staying in this old camper. And it was mother and father and their 3 kids. They had their 2 oldest were boys, aged 9 and 7, and their youngest was a girl who was 3. And the parents worked at the Peach Bottom Atomic Power Station, which, as I mentioned, used to be Mcconkey Mansion. One day while they were away, they left the kids at the camper. This is the 70s, so if you were 9 years old, you were capable of watching your little brother and sister. So they left their kids at home, and the kids were off playing in the woods near the camper. And while they were playing, all of a sudden, one of the boys sees this dark-skinned, long-fingered hand wrap around a tree nearby. And then he looks up from where he sees this hand, and he sees a humanoid face. And he said that the face looked like a human, except that the entire face was covered with brown hair. And then the thing stepped out from behind a tree, and they said it was over 6 feet tall, and it was covered in mud-caked fur. And at first it stood there kind of like leaning out from around the tree looking at them. But then it started to approach them, and it got within 10 feet of them. And then it stopped, and it just stood there watching them. So, I mean, these kids are 9, 7, and 3. So obviously this is absolutely terrifying. So the oldest tells the 7-year-old to grab his little sister and get the fuck out of there. And they take off running. And when their parents get back, they tell them what had happened. And the parents had heard about other similar sightings in the area. So they decided at this point they were not going to be in the camper. They would wait for their house to be finished somewhere else. So they left the area, and a few weeks later, when their house was built, the father goes out to retrieve the camper and bring it back. And so he goes out to where the camper was, and the camper's not there. And this was his property. He had not authorized anyone else to come on his property. There was no evidence that the camper had been towed out of there. So he's looking around, and he ends up seeing that the camper got pushed down a hill, and it was floating in the Susquehanna River.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, think about what it would take to move a camper. Typically it's a big-ass truck,
Yeah.
But there was no evidence of anything pulling in. There was it's private property for one, and there was no evidence that anything had driven in. So how the hell did that happen?
Right. Wow.
But these things, whatever they are, they seem to be pretty bold, with this thing just blatantly approaching the kids and then throwing the fucking camper in the river. And then in 1975, there was a family who was actually living near Mount Nebo Church. They claimed that the way that they worded it is they were being haunted by a hairy bipedal creature. And the way that it would start would be in the distance, they would hear these loud screams. And then as it approached their property, it would lower until these grunting noises.
Oh, God.
And sometimes it would be so loud that it would wake the family up from a sound sleep in the middle of the night. And it would push around their garbage cans, walk around their house, and on more than one occasion, it actually walked up and was walking around on their back porch.
Ooh, fuck that.
But they said that this thing was haunting them for over a year. It would just come to their property, and it never like attacked them or was aggressive, but they would always hear the screams and grunts, and it would fuck with their shit outside.
That's fucked up, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like you said, you hear those noises, and then to have physical evidence of something being moved around outside and then hearing something big walking on your back porch.
Yeah, well, how about the sounds changing, like their attitude and as they approach, going from screaming to slow grunting, like
to grunting, right?
Ugh.
What's that all about?
All psyching itself up to scare the fuck out of some people.
Yeah. But by the late 70s, not only did we have an even larger increase in Bigfoot sightings, but now there were UFO sightings being reported. And UFOs were being reported over the Delta area, and Peach Bottom. And this included multiple sightings of glowing lights hovering over the atomic power plant.
Uh-oh.
And a lot of times in the same area where these UFOs were seen, there would be a Bigfoot sighting. There's one really weird case that happened in 78 that I wanted to talk about, because I don't really know, like, it's very strange. So this is another case where these people were kind of being stalked by some sort of thing. So what had happened was in January 27th, 1978, or, well, I guess at this point it was January 26th, but the Hilsmeyer family were kept up all night long with their dogs going nuts, like in a panic, just constantly barking, like something was freaking them out. They couldn't get them to shut up, so they were up all night. The next morning, Alan Hilsmeyer went outside, and he sees this trail of three-toed footprints in the snow. And he measured the footprints. They were 16 inches long, 6 inches wide, 3 toes, and the stride was 5 feet between each step. And he said the footprints were in line with one another. Like, you know how when we walk, it's, if we were leaving prints, we'd have left foot, right foot, like side, not so much side by side, but kind of running parallel to one another in a trail. He said the way this thing was walking was that it would be 1 foot, and then it would 5 feet later, you'd have the other foot come down, like, but in the same line. So it was like purposefully swinging its legs forward to make it like a line of individual footprints rather than side by side footprints.
That's weird.
Yeah. And he said there were over 2,000 prints that were left, and he followed them for over 2 miles. And no matter what the terrain was, the stride never changed. It was always 5 feet between the steps. And he followed this through fields, over barbed wire fences, which some of the barbed wire fences had hair left in them. He went through the woods, across a creek, up a hill, into another field, and in the middle of the field, the tracks just disappeared, completely gone. There was nothing indicating anything had walked out any other way. There was nothing to indicate that something had driven out there. Just middle of the field, the footprints ended, and that was it. Gone.
Now, with just hearing that, would you attribute that to being a Bigfoot or something else?
Well, here's the thing. The three-toed footprints, while it seems weird, is a reoccurring thing, especially with the weirder Bigfoot sightings. But the Boggy Creek monster, all the footprints attributed to that, three-toed footprints.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We talked about a cave like a couple of years ago where there was some sort of weird creature that lived in there that left a 3-toed footprint. The goblin sightings in Kentucky, those are all 3-toed footprints. Like this, it seems to be like a reoccurring thing. And a lot of for some reason with the Bigfoot sightings, it's certain areas that report Bigfoot have these 3-toed footprints, while other areas that'll have a Bigfoot sighting will have, the 5-toed with that weird, like, thumb toe thing that they have.
Thumb toe?
Yeah. But, most of the sightings in this area, or most of the footprints that were found in the area, seem to be of the 3-toed variety. There were some 5-toed footprints found as well, but most of them in this area seem to be the 3-toed prints. So the fact that it just disappeared, I mean, it had to have gone somewhere, right? It's not like it just fucking vanished into thin air, or did it? Did it open a portal and walk through?
Maybe it hitched a ride with a UFO.
But so with the missing 411 stuff, the ones, any of the ones that are related to these hairy things that, the ones that the kids say a bear man kept him safe, or a hairy dog man, or something, there's a bunch of them where the kids were missing for days, and they said when they're found again, they say that this hairy thing kept them safe, and they were able to hear people, but they couldn't say the people couldn't hear them. So it's like almost like they're in this weird bubble thing. So what if it's like that, a similar deal, like it's just like a dimension that exists kind of on top of ours, but almost in a bubble sort of thing, where it's accessible but not at the same time.
Right. Like,
and maybe that's how they get around.
Yeah. Like it just phases into a different dimension. It's physically not there in our realm anymore, but it's
right. But it's still there.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. It's really hard to explain, or to like wrap your head around. But this family, so they had no indication at all what this thing was, other than the hair that was left in the fence. And then they found, as they were following the foot tracks, they found a half-eaten rabbit and a dead calf that had been partially eaten. And the farmer who owned the calf said that the calf was already dead, but something had eaten from it. Now, the rabbit, the half-eaten rabbit, and the calf, I mean, that honestly could be anything, but it's a coincidence maybe that it was found along the same trail as these footprints. But,
right.
That to me doesn't seem very likely. I would have to assume whatever made the footprints was probably snacking along the way. Got a little hungry.
If something's snacking along the way and he traced these steps for 2 miles, I mean, wouldn't you think he'd eventually run into some scat?
I mean, not necessarily. I could eat a sandwich and go walk 2 miles and not have to take a dump. Just say it, man. He's snacking on the way. He's going home. He's like, I'll just wait till I get there. But whatever this thing was, seems to have come back again that summer. And they heard Mrs. Hilsmeyer actually was the one that reported this one, but they heard the screams from the distance, and then they started hearing this howling sound. And Miss Hilsmeyer described it as sounding like Mighty Joe Young. And for anyone who doesn't know Mighty Joe Young, it's a giant gorilla movie. Mighty Joe Young being the giant gorilla. So, just picture a giant gorilla noise from Hollywood. And that's what she heard. But there's an interesting point that's made in among all these reports. And it's all about context, I think, and where this stuff takes place. So let's go back to the first event from 1972 with the rocks just being tossed down from the hill from nowhere. Now, it takes place in the woods, So immediately, because it's in the woods, you attribute it to being something that's, some sort of animal or person or some creature. But look at poltergeist events, like where our stones just come flying down out of nowhere, and there's nothing to attribute that to. And then in the woods, you've got these beings that are lurking behind trees. A lot of times, all you're seeing is like this shadowy outline. And then in hauntings in a house, you've got shadow people sightings. And because it's in a house, like you're like, oh, it's a ghost. But if it takes place in the woods, it's got to be a fucking creature of some sort. What if this shit is like the same thing? It's just out in nature. It's being experienced.
Whoa. That's a weird thing to think about. Like just like a haunted area.
Yeah.
Damn, you always assume that it like needs a house. It needs something that people are attached to or something. But I guess Hollywood a little bit. I mean, most ghosts in haunting cases come from like, even if it's like a factory, it like takes place indoors.
Right. And a lot of hauntings, you'll have reports of ghost lights. And in the woods, you'll have like will-o'-the-wisp or fairy lights. Or, you could even attribute that to UFO sightings. You see it in the sky. It doesn't mean because it's in the sky that it's a craft. It doesn't need to be a craft. It doesn't need to be fucking aliens.
Right.
It could just be the same phenomenon, just, repeating, just in different places. And it's just because we're observing it in different ways, we're kind of putting different labels on it. When you talk about that shadow person sighting and you saw its fucking teeth, like shadows don't have teeth. What the fuck was it?
Yeah.
Like if you saw that in the woods and you just saw the shadowy thing and you saw teeth, you'd have a completely different take on what your experience was.
That's very true. It instantly become a creature instead of a spirit-like entity.
Yeah.
Huh.
So I don't know, man. Like and the fact that there's 2 well-known haunted houses in the area, there's stories of these ghosts along the streets in the 1800s, and even they bring up the Fae, like the leprechauns, and then UFO sightings. It's just all, and the fact that a lot of it centers around an old quarry and a power plant is pretty interesting to me.
Right, a little Mothman-ish.
Yeah, exactly. But here's another thing about this area. And we did an episode on this alone before, but nearby is Chestnut Ridge. And do you remember the Bigfoot story from Chestnut Ridge?
A few of them. I remember the one where the craft landed and they walked along the fence.
Yeah. And they shot at him.
Yeah, and it did nothing.
Yeah. But if I don't know if you remember this detail, but he said when he shot them, it sounded like he was shooting water.
Yeah.
Like, how weird is that? Like, he said he knew he hit them, or hit one of them, but it sounded like he shot water.
Yeah, I didn't attribute that to being a Bigfoot either when we talked about Chestnut Ridge. And I mean, that dude tracking that trail that with the 3-toed things. I mean, anytime 3 toes are brought up, I immediately exclude Bigfoot. Do you?
I don't. Because of all the different Bigfoot creatures that are reported that go along with 3-toed footprints. To me, it I don't know. It seems like they might be a different sort of thing. Because why would there be some 5-toed and some 3-toed? And I know the flesh and blood hidden animal theorists would say that it's some sort of biological defect or something, maybe through inbreeding or something. But typically with inbreeding, you're going to get an extra finger or an extra toe. Like look at cats. that have a history of inbreeding. They've got like 27 toes on one foot. You know, like it just looks like this weird. I don't even know. I had a cat that had like 6 toes on all of its paws. It was, I think one paw had 7 toes. It looked bonkers. But
you're right though. I mean, it's usually the gaining of an appendage.
Right. Yeah. So maybe it's the 5-toed ones that are the freaks. Like, oh, look at old 5 toes over here. He's like, oh, I like my 5 toes. Like, yeah, I bet you wish you had 3 big ones like this, though. And they wiggle their 3 big toes, and poor Jerry is over there with 5 toes. And he's like, oh, man, you guys suck. I'm going to go live with the people. They appreciate my 5 toes.
See, I don't know. Just the whole traditional Bigfoot thing, we're talking about, I mean, you can call it as human as you want or intelligent as you want, but this is still a giant fucking primate we're talking about here. And if we're seeing 3...
Unless it's not a giant primate, though. What if it just looks like a giant primate?
Well, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's walking around the earth and we're observing it. That's what it is to us. And all the photos and videos and testimony describe an ape-like being. But it's just something 3-toed. If it was like 1 or 2 times, I mean, they talked about 3-toed prints on Hellier, and they always have some type of reptilian feature to it. Something,
right?
You know?
Yeah.
So I mean, if we were just getting a couple cases like that, I would say that's got to be some, I mean, mutated Bigfoot. But if there's so many different cases of 3-toed prints, and it's not real, you know, that are not linked to Bigfoot, like Hopkinsville goblins and shit like that. And they vary in size too. So for me, I instantly separate Bigfoot from 3-toed footprints.
You know what's weird? And I didn't bring up any cases because they weren't relevant to the area we're talking about. But in future shows, we'll get to it. But with a lot of Bigfoot sightings, there are also these weird women in white sightings that correspond with them.
I've heard a little bit about this.
Which, what the fuck is that all about?
Right.
Like, it just adds to the weirdness, man. Like, you got 3-toed footprints, you got women in white, you've got fucking ghost lights. There's a case of a Bigfoot that was kind of like carrying this glowing ball.
Yeah, I remember
through
that.
the woods. Like, what the fuck? What is going on with Bigfoot? Why is he so magical? That's what I want to know. Share your magic, Bigfoot. Like, can we get, if there's any Bigfoots, big feet, for one, tell me what to call you guys, because I feel like calling you Bigfoot is rude. And I could call you Sasquatch, but I don't know if you're into that either. So if you could let me know that, first and foremost. Secondly, teach us your magic. I want to know the magic of the Bigfoot. And if I've got to become like a weird forest-dwelling hairy guy in the woods, I'll grow as much hair as I can. I mean, I'm not particularly hairy, but I'll do it for you guys, man. I'll romp around naked in the woods and leave 3-toed foot. I'll cut a couple toes off if you'll teach me your magic.
Just let me in.
Yeah, just let me in. I'll strip down. I'll cut my toes off. I'll grow my hairs all out. I'll eat rabbits.
I'll throw rocks at people.
Yeah, I'll throw rocks. I'll peek around trees and spook people.
Practice your scream to howl technique.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. That is a good one. But I feel like I already do that with all our silly songs.
Yeah, it'll come natural to you.
Yeah, it will. So the next song by the Whatcast is just going to be me making Bigfoot noises. Well, Mateo does a bunch of blast beats.
Yeah.
Bigfoot core.
Crypto core.
Yeah, crypto core. That's perfect.
Yeah,
But the stuff still persists, though, man, in this area. Like, there's still Bigfoot sightings. There's still fucking UFO sightings. And it's just the way it is. Like, all the Bigfoot, like, this Bigfoot researcher organization, they're like the MUFON of of Bigfoot reports or Bigfoot sightings. They're basically MUFON for Bigfoot.
Yeah, I remember that documentary about Chestnut Ridge and that episode we did on it. All that shit was wacky enough, but to hear that it's going on all around that area, I wonder if there's any ranches there.
I mean, Chestnut Ridge was, for anyone that didn't listen to the show or isn't familiar, there's a lot more there than just Bigfoot sightings. Although there are a lot of Bigfoot sightings, there was a Thunderbird sighting there, plenty of UFO sightings. It's just one of those, this area just seems to be one of those places where there's, like, I don't know, doorways or portals or what, but it seems to attract the weirdness. I don't know how else to describe it.
Right.
But most of these sightings kind of follow the same sort of thing. Mystery howls, three-toed footprints, creepers creeping, that sort of thing. Luckily, they don't seem to be aggressive. And even that one that threw the camper in the river, I mean, you got to think, if he was 10 foot away from little kids and he's got a 5-foot stride, little kids running isn't gonna, if he wanted to break them in half, it would have been no problem.
Right.
So they don't seem to be particularly aggressive. They just like to cause a ruckus and occasionally throw rocks. But I like to think that they were throwing rocks because they were like, I think among themselves, they're like, we're going to give these guys 3 days. And in 3 days, if they don't come back, we're taking that canoe. And then they were like walking towards the canoe and they came back for it. And they're like, oh, God damn it. Let's scare them off. Throw fucking rocks. I was looking forward to that canoe trip. Like, they packed a lunch. They were going to go down the Susquehanna River in this thing. It was going to be like the adventure of a lifetime. It was going to be great. And these stupid humans ruined it for them. I don't blame them for throwing rocks, man. Just let them have the canoe. Let them go on their Bigfoot picnic.
Give the Bigfoot the canoe.
Yeah, just give them the canoe, man. Nobody needs to get hurt.
Thank you for listening to the Whatcast. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, iTunes, and YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Get yourself a Whatcast t-shirt or a sticker pack. Who was that dude on that one episode? Try the links in Homie's page. All this and more can be found at www.thewhatcasters.com. Thanks again for listening and have a great week.